Hello and welcome to this first lecture of Philosophy 100. This is the first sort of real lecture with an actual topic on the course, in the course. And this lecture is going to be brought to you by Joey the Bernese Mountain Dog. The topic for today's lecture is racism and sexism. It's a sort of a couple of issues in the philosophy of sort of applied ethics, which is, if you followed the earlier lectures, a sub sort of part of ethics, where we deal with sort of more practical ethical issues. And sort of the reason we're starting here is to kind of start with issues that philosophy, issues that actually matter to our lives, that philosophy, in some sense, can have something to say about, can help us think about. I really wanted to sort of start this class by discussing issues. Sometimes philosophy gets really down in the weeds and seems completely pointless because it seems so far away from issues that actually matter to our lives. Well, racism and sexism really do matter to our lives. And so I want to sort of start off with these to sort of help everybody see how philosophical issues, how it is that you can kind of get stuck in the weeds, and why it is that philosophers do sometimes end up talking about things that are a little bit like that are so abstract that it's hard to see how they're relevant. And the way that we're going to do that is by starting at the top with issues that are super practical and super relevant. All right. So in applied philosophy and ethics, we ask questions like what matters and why certain things matter. And in particular, in this case, we can ask the questions: why is it that sexism matters today? Sexism and racism. Why is it that racism matters today? And what about it matters? Well, first of all, clearly there are a bunch of current events going on today that bring it to our attention, right? The Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and the Me Too movement, both of which have been drawing our attention to issues of racism and sexism, issues of sort of police brutality, and the rampant issues of the patriarchy, where people just don't believe women, right? These events, these movements are attempts to respond to the rampant sort of out there racism and institutional racism and the police brutality that is being, that minorities are experiencing. And the Me Too movement is a strong response to the general cultural blindness that we have to rampant misogyny. That is to the actual mistreatment of women and not believing them when they say certain kinds of things. So here's a couple of issues that are worth thinking about, right? So Black Lives Matter, clearly a big movement these days to try and remind everyone that not only some subcultures matter, that the lives of Black people really do matter as much as everyone else's. Here are some recent cases that are super relevant right now. Jacob Blake, just the other day, was shot 7 times in the back while about to enter his vehicle. Breonna Taylor was shot and killed while she was sleeping when the police entered her apartment looking for someone else. Crazy cases. Here are other issues that are sort of relevant today with respect to racism. The Karens, right? These often, at least so far, it's been a number of white women calling the police on certain acts of people of minorities. I think the one on the left here actually called the police on a Black family having a barbecue, and the woman on the right called the police after a Black man asked her to put her leash back on her dog while in the park. With respect to the Me Too movement, here's the hopefully some of you may have gone to the Women's March in Los Angeles or even here in Santa Barbara at some point. And here's some of the people that they're responding to, right? So Brett Kavanaugh is Supreme Court Justice, but was accused of sexually inappropriate conduct when he was younger. And here's him responding, being totally outraged by being accused. Harvey Weinstein, clearly a really awful, kind of creepy, sexual, misogynistic type of person that was forcing himself in really disturbing ways onto women. And Brock Turner, if you've heard of this case, was I believe, a swimmer at the University of Stanford, and he forcefully attempted to rape a woman that I think was actually a UCSB student at the time. And he ended up getting a really light sentence for the attempted rape. And then, sort of, here's another reason that this is all such a big deal right now. That the sort of Donald Trump claiming that he's the least racist person in the world, even though he's, he'd called a bunch of places shithole countries that were, predominantly African. And I mean, he's claimed that Mexicans are rapists, and really, he said very, very awful things that seem clearly racist. And then similarly, he was caught on audio tape saying some really atrocious things about sexually assaulting women. So all of these are clearly big issues right now, and it's sort of, I think it's very interesting to think about what philosophy has to say about them. How to think about these kinds of issues in a careful, somewhat calm, somewhat structured way. So these are huge problems. So what are they, right? What is racism? And here's some issues that we should think about. Does racism have a definition? That is, like, the word racism, how do you define it? What kinds of things count as racism? And what kinds of things count as racist actions? Similarly, what other kinds of things are there what things don't count as racism that people tend to call racism? And why are those things racist or not racist? Similarly, we can just swap in what is sexism? Does sexism have a definition? What counts as a sexist action? What doesn't count as a sexist action, and why? This leads us to sort of in the beginning of attempting to start thinking about these things. This leads us to what I will call the Socratic Question. The Socratic Question really is to sort of put emphasis on the word is. We ask, what is racism? What is sexism? In the same way that we ask things like in philosophy, like, what is justice? What is democracy? What is beauty? What is love? When Socrates asks these questions, Socrates was probably the first sort of big deal philosopher. We know some of his teachings as written down by Plato. He was sort of an ancient Greek philosopher that went around pestering people in Athens, asking them questions. Eventually, by asking so many questions, they got so fed up with him that they sentenced him to death. Here's a painting of him drinking hemlock at his sentencing after having been sentenced to death. He had the opportunity to escape Athens, but he decided that he'd rather die on principle. Socrates asked people lots of different questions, and in particular, he focused on this sort of big is. What is, justice? And here we ask, what is racism? And one thing that people tend to do when they would respond to Socrates is they'd give him examples. So what I just did earlier is gave you examples of racism and sexism, right? By pointing out issues with police brutality, by pointing out issues like the Brock Turner case or Brett Kavanaugh's issues or Harvey Weinstein's issues. I was giving you examples of sexism and racism, and I was basically just pointing to them. Socrates would be very unsatisfied with my just pointing out examples, right? You could collect all of the cases of sexism and racism and put them into sort of a category, right? And call it sexism or racism. But just by collecting all of the cases, sort of documenting them all in a certain sense, you wouldn't have said what sexism is or what racism is. You would just have a bunch of instances of sexism and instances of racism. What we want to know, and sort of what the Socratic question really is trying to push us to, is to answer the question what it is that each instance of racism has in common with each other instance of racism. And similarly for sexism, what is it about each case where there's obviously a sexist action or a sexist institution? What is it about each of those cases that is the same across cases? That is, what is it that makes different cases the same with respect to sexism or with respect to racism? What properties of the case make it a racist case? What properties of the case make it a sexist case? That's the thing that Socrates is after. He wants to find out what's at the core, what's at the nature of these things. All right, a sort of caveat. Before we try to understand both racism and sexism under a similar rubric, we should recognize that they are really distinct issues. I'm comparing them here partly due to like time constraints, but also because they do have similar structures with respect to discrimination and harm in general. But they are very different in certain respects. In particular, sexism and racism are different with respect to their history. Sexism, in one form or another, has probably been around and prevalent in human societies since the creation of human societies. Maybe even around back before societies when people were just in sort of tribal situations where familial roles, made it that, women had to play subservient roles. Racism, on the other hand, while it probably is quite old with respect to societies, much of its origins with respect to the ways in which we think about it relate back to a specific sort of theorizing that came about and came to prominence in the early 20th century with Nazism. Where the Nazis tried to place one race above all others. Racism clearly has more broad applications than just the ways the Nazis were using it. But that's, in a certain sense, where we get some of the theorizing about it, and that has sort of embedded itself into modern culture and ways of thinking about it. I mean, clearly racism was around well before that. It's just nobody was calling it that. Nobody was thinking in those terms exactly. While racism today in the US is still sort of often seen as an issue between whites and other races, there's a lot sort of more broad applications for it. And using the term racism in explanations of certain kinds of actions is definitely broader, right? So I don't know if any of you have heard of the Rwandan genocide, but in Rwanda, there was a genocide where the two different, basically tribes, were murdering each other, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And plausibly, this atrocity has a certain sort of racism-based explanation, but it's sort of a different and kind of confusing case because they weren't actually of different races. The Hutus and Tutsis are of different ethnic groups, basically of just different tribes, where in a certain sense they're ethnically the same. It's just kind of a name. It's a name only, that they are different. Obviously, also the Holocaust has a certain sort of racist explanation, or I mean, a racism-based explanation, right? Explaining the Holocaust is not somehow racist. Another stark difference between these two is that sex is a biological category, and oops. I'll go back to this for a sec. Sex is a biological category that's widely used and accepted as a distinction in sort of reality, right? It's what we might call a natural kind, male versus female in a certain sense, right? We use it in biology all the time. However, race is an extremely controversial notion. It doesn't have a widely accepted use in any in any science that we currently have. I mean, so clearly certain sciences use the notion of race, the term race, and they discuss race, but there's a lot of debate both in those subdisciplines like sociology and anthropology, and philosophy. There's a lot of debate about what a race is and whether there is such a thing. It doesn't seem really to be a biological notion. There isn't substantial difference between the biologies of people that seem to be of different races. It's possible that there's an anthropological distinction and maybe a sociological distinction, but it's really, I mean, it's clear we've got to distinguish these kinds of things. We need to be clear that ethnic relations that have to do with cultural differences are going to be different than racial differences, right? Theoretically, one could be an ethnocentrist, that is, thinking that one's own culture is somehow superior to others without being a racist. I mean, sometimes these things get run together. For the most part, racism has come to encompass this sort of issue. But if we want to be really careful, kind of pedantic almost, we can distinguish these things. For our purposes, the big difference is that sex, biological sex, seems to be a natural kind, where, I mean, you know, and here I'm distinguishing sex from gender, where gender has more to do with social institutions and pressures involved there, while race, if it is something like a natural kind, is a much more complex matter. Race is not like sex. It's also not clearly like gender. As we can see in the case of Rachel Dolezal, the woman that claims to be transracial, there's an outcry of people that seem to think that it's not possible to be transracial. And I mean, that's a very complicated case. If it's possible to be transgendered but not possible to be transracial, that just goes to show that at least it's like very difficult to sort of parse out exactly what these things are and what's going on in each of these cases. I will plead ignorance to the complexity of these cases. If you are interested, I highly suggest continuing to study these by going to feminist studies programs, or taking some feminist studies classes, taking some race study classes, etc. Differences aside between sexism and racism, though, some of the similarities, there are similarities with respect to how we should think about both, and that's why I've put them together. Whoops, sorry. I guess I went to the wrong slide. All right, so let's start off with sexism. What is sexism? In their article on sexism, the one that I posted for you to look at for this lecture, Cudd and Jones give a list of the ways that women are disenfranchised, disadvantaged, and deprived of all sorts of goods around the world. They give two general explanations of this general degradation: that women are somehow inferior to men, or that women are systematically disadvantaged by society. Now, Cutt and Jones take issue with the first one, of course, and wish to give some explanation of the second. You know, they don't think that women are inferior to men, and wish to give an explanation of why women are systematically disadvantaged by society. We're going to discuss a few aspects here relevant and hopefully interesting. Their definition of sexism is this. Sexism is anything that creates, constitutes, promotes, sustains, or exploits an unjustifiable distinction between the sexes. This is a rather broad definition and should be contrasted with a more narrow definition, like the one that Professor Bloom gives in the article that we read, or that we're going to look at on racism, where Bloom defines racism more narrowly. What the issue here is, or might be, is that if this definition is too broad, it will encapsulate certain things. It'll include certain things that just don't seem to be sexist, but count as sexist under this definition. Let me just back up and think about this. So we might also define sexism more narrowly. And so this is what we might define sexism along these lines as activities, proclivities, or stereotypes that promote what we will call the inferiorization or antipathy towards someone because of their sex. Sorry about that. Lost my place for half a second. All right, so back to it. What I mean to be saying here is that there could be this sort of issue with this general definition of sexism that's kind of broad. We could run into categorizing things as sexist that just don't really seem sexist. So here's maybe an example. I'm not sure. Maybe this is an example of sexism, but suppose we have this stereotype that says, women are caregivers. And then suppose that it turns out that the stereotype is unjustifiable. That is, women are, caregivers and men are not caregivers, right? Like that doesn't seem actually justifiable in certain respects. Now, if basically we're using this, stereotype and the stereotype itself has created an unjustifiable distinction between the sexes, then it's a sexist distinction, right? To say that women are caregivers. Well, that just seems a little bit wrong-headed, right? Saying women are caregivers isn't derogatory really in any serious sense, and that's kind of the issue. There, at the very least, it seems like, at least to me, it seems that sexist activities or attitudes often involve a certain kind of derogatory attitude as well, and as well as the unjustifiable distinction. And so it seems that we might need something beyond, something more narrow than this in order to capture things more specifically. What about racism? Racism, according to Bloom in the article that I posted up on Canvas, gives this definition. Racism is any activities, proclivities, or stereotypes that promote inferiorization or antipathy towards another race or individuals based on their race. And we'll talk about what inferiorization or antipathy mean later. But this uh, this definition is narrow, and then so we might want to ask whether or not it's too narrow, and then ask if it is going to be too narrow, what kinds of things that we would normally think of maybe as racist are going to get left out. Here's sort of the issue. If you looked at the article, Bloom tries to define racism narrowly in order to make it that certain things that we sometimes call racist don't count as racist, because he wants to define them or distinguish them in different kinds of ways. He wants to be more careful with the concept of race or racism, in order to distinguish between different kinds of issues, different kinds of moral issues that can be at play here. He thinks it's unhelpful for us to use the word race or racist as a catch-all term, basically. He thinks that there's this thing happen called conceptual drift, where the term racist or racism has lost some of its sort of political and moral oomph. That is, when you call someone a racist because they do certain things that they don't really perceive as wrong in certain ways, then you just don't have the same kind of oomph with your judgments. Here's the kind of thing that's at issue, right? So Bloom wishes to be more careful. He gives this example, at least at one point, of the white school teacher. So the white school teacher has, let's say, a pretty ethnically diverse classroom, racially diverse classroom. She has lots of white students and black students. But when it comes to, do the student teacher conferences, she's fine with all of her students. She doesn't treat her students any differently based on their race. But when it comes to meeting with the parents at the parent teacher conferences, she becomes, more defensive or more concerned and confused at how to deal with the concerns of the black parents that are there to meet with her. Now, question: is this white teacher acting in a racist way? Well, Bloom wishes to say something like, he thinks no. He thinks that in this case, that's not a racist action. It's something that he calls racial anxiety. And he wants to sort of distinguish between racism, outright racism, and things like racial anxiety or racial stereotypes and other racial disparities that he doesn't think are always racist because they don't involve inferiorization or antipathy. And I think that in a certain sense is right, but it also probably is too narrow of a definition, because insofar as certain kinds of things don't, especially I think certain kinds of institutional racism, don't involve inferiorization or antipathy and still yet are racist. We can talk about those in a minute. All right, so now let's get to sort of doing some real philosophy. So we've got a couple of definitions on deck for racism and sexism. Let's start thinking about cases, and let's start making more distinctions. So let's think about kinds of racism that there are. Intrinsic versus extrinsic is a kind of distinction that we tend to make in philosophy for all kinds of things. And we can make it here for both racism and sexism. An intrinsic kind of racism or sexism is going to be one that is motivated by hatred or fear, and often involves a believed inferiority of the other. So the idea here is the person that's racist or sexist is racist or sexist because they believe that the other, the person that is racially different or that is sexually has a different sex, that they somehow are they have some they're inferior because of what they are, right? So the idea here is like examples would be hating black people because they're black, because you think that black people are somehow less. or hating women because you think that they are somehow less. That's an example of an intrinsic form of racism and sexism. Extrinsic forms of racism and sexism are going to be based on perceived or believed inferiority based on some external aspect or ability, right? So the idea here would be something like, instead of thinking, say, take the misogynist, and instead of thinking that women are, bad because they're women, it's something that they can or can't do, right? And the idea here is that, women aren't as desirable or aren't as good as men because they aren't as strong as men, right? So it's this like external feature of women that somehow makes them bad or less valuable. Similarly, in racial cases, right? Things like supposing that Jewish people are greedy, I don't know, that certain groups of people are lazy, things like that, where the idea is that there's these extrinsic features of this group, and that's the thing that makes them lesser. That's the thing that inferiorizes them. Two further distinctions are going to be intentional versus implicit forms of sexism and racism. And then given these both of these distinctions, we can combine them and come up with lots of different cases. So let's take first intentional racism and sexism. Intentional racism and sexism are sort of the obvious cases where we've got, active intended acts. So an intentional intrinsic form of racism would be someone saying, hey, that man shouldn't be president because blacks are inferior, right? That would be an intentional, an intrinsic view of racism, thinking that black people are just inferior because they're black. An intentional extrinsic form of sexism would be something like this: hey, that woman should not be in the military because she won't be able to do the job, right? Where the idea is like that she is not strong enough in order to get the job done, or that because women, have a menstrual cycle, that somehow they're not going to always be able to be up for doing whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing. That's a case of intentional extrinsic sexism, where the person is intentionally doing something, saying something, uttering something, and they're doing it on the basis of an extrinsic feature of the person that they are, in a sense, slandering. Distinct from intentional forms, we've got also implicit or passive forms of sexism and racism. These are often unintentional. I mean, it's possible, I guess, for them to be intentional in some sense, but usually they're unintentional. And here's some cases, right? So an implicit, intrinsic form of racism would be maybe like your grandma's version of unintentional racism, where she has some sort of automatic reaction that she doesn't have any control over when she, sees in my own mother's case, she has an automatic reaction, I think, to Asian people that are bad drivers. And I mean, I call her out on it, but she's still, it's something that it's implicit. It's sort of passive. It's an automatic response, and it's intrinsic in that it's, for some reason, she thinks it's something about them that makes it an issue. Another example might be mansplaining. Mansplaining is when a guy thinks that he understands some concept better than his female conversant, even though she, may well be an expert on the subject that he then goes on to explain to her. In this kind of case, often the sexism is completely unintentional and in a sense passive, but it is still sexism. Right. Because it's not, it's intrinsic, sorry, it's intrinsic sexism, because the idea here is supposed to be in some way that the man thinks that the woman wouldn't be able to know the information that he's giving her without him having explained it. Implicit and extrinsic forms of sexism and racism are going to be a little bit different, right? So an implicit form of extrinsic racism would be maybe police profiling, where the idea is that the thought is that Black people are suspicious, and so we get some kind of racist activity on the basis of an extrinsically or a perceived extrinsic quality. And maybe something like the pink tax is the sexist equivalent here, where generally products that are sold to both men and women, the products sold to women tend to be to cost more, even if you've got exactly the same product. Where the idea here is that it's some kind of, there's some kind of implicit, maybe unintentional. I mean, maybe it's intentional in some cases, but I think often maybe unintentional way of seeing some form of sexism here. All right, let's think of 3 different levels of sexism and racism. Now, there is, of course, and we sort of already touched on this, the obvious case of cases of sexism and racism. The intentional interpersonal forms of sexism and racism, right? These are the kinds of cases where one person acts with regards to another person, saying harmful or doing harmful things to that person on the basis of their sex or race. So in this case, like a sexist case would be, like men speaking over women out of the belief that the woman's opinions are somehow unimportant or not to be taken seriously. And maybe racism, cases of people yelling racial slurs, people giving purposeful differential treatment, etc. These are sort of, when it comes to thinking about sexism and racism, these are the bread and butter cases where we're, if you were trying to say something about like, oh, that person's a racist, you'd obviously think they're a racist if you pointed out a case in which they acted purposefully differential towards a different race or used a racial slur. But there are less obvious cases, right, than just the intentional cases. In particular, I think sort of the unconscious or maybe internalized cases are often the ones that go unnoticed the most and need to be rooted out. In these cases, we've got sort of tacit emotions, attitudes, and beliefs that constitute, create, or promote inequalities. And also, they also involve like ignorant actions where people have a sort of unknown, where people don't know the connotations, right? So, for example, something like a case of blackface, where somebody, doesn't know the history of the thing. If you don't know, blackface was a way of, you had white actors painting their faces black and playing African American characters, and oftentimes in a derogatory way. And so now, every once in a while it comes to light that someone painted their face black at some point in order to, dress up as or play an African American character, and maybe they didn't know about the derogatory nature of blackface in history. But still, what they're doing is racist. It has racist connotations, and even if they're ignorant of their actions, right? This is the unconscious form, and unconscious or ignorant form of racism. Sexism, we get things like ways in which men are often privileged unconsciously, or women are disadvantaged unknowingly. That is like, I don't know, things like um, taking advantage of women's inability, or not inability, non oftentimes in business settings where there's sort of money on the table for trying to get uh, more compensation for your job, right? You're asking for a raise or something like that. Supposedly, there's uh, more often than not, women are less inclined to ask for more. And somehow this, I mean, and this often leads to a disparity in how much women are paid versus men. Um, Now, is this purposeful? I'd say it's unclear. I'd say it's more likely than not an unconscious form of discrimination against women. Um, but it exists, and it hinges on taking advantage of certain structures where, where there's a certain power dynamic, the power dynamic of the boss and the employee, and it takes it takes an even like harsher sort of case. It really exploits the issue where certain kinds of people, want to be non-confrontational, uh, and if you're of that category, then usually you won't um, ask for more money. And I guess, I mean, I'm not 100% on this. This may be an unjustifiable uh, distinction between the sexes, but I think at least, I don't know, maybe it's an accurate stereotype, maybe it's not one, but it seems to me that more often than not, women uh, are more likely to be against confrontation and try to avoid confrontation when possible. Racism here, we've got things like differential treatment, not being as nice to people of other races, certain other problematic automatic stereotypes. So like issues where if you're walking down a street at night and you see someone in the distance and you quickly, change direction or go across the street so that you don't pass the person on the same side of the street, some kind of automatic responses that are not under your control. Those are unconscious cases, and maybe they're not even no actions come from them sometimes, right? No, but these are racially attuned biases that you might have, and they can lead to overt, or I mean unconscious acts of racism and sexism. And then finally, what I take to be the least obvious form of sexism and racism, institutional or systemic sexism and racism. Uh, these kinds of inequalities are rampant in society, but often unseen because they're taken as normal in some sense or other, right? So these are inequalities enforced by explicit rules or implicit norms at the level of the governing structure or social structures, right? Like sexual inequalities, things like where, things like the fact that women didn't get the right to vote until a century ago, or own property. Certain religious institutions that still place women in subservient roles within hierarchy, things like the healthcare system, where for some reason women are encouraged to go into certain kinds of more subservient roles, like nursing, where there's a lot more female nurses than there are male nurses, and a lot more male doctors than there are female doctors. What gives the doctors tend to get paid more, but they don't have to go through that much more schooling in order to become the level at which they're, at which they operate. with respect to racism, there's, bank loans, restrictive lending is this thing called redlining that used to happen a lot, where certain kinds of loans wouldn't go to certain kinds of people. Environmental racism is this sort of institutional or systemic racism, where, so suppose we're going to build a power plant in a city in order to bring energy to the city, electricity. Where are we going to build the power plant? Well, if you tried to build a power plant near some white people's neighborhoods, you're going to get a lot of pushback. So, oh, I know, well, let's put it over here where the, ethnic minority neighborhoods are. Those people aren't going to push back because they don't know any better or something like that, right? Like you end up with this kind of environmental racism that is rampant in certain institutions. Things like Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation back in the day, those were institutionalized forms of racism. Currently, things like the unjust police practices that are going on, certain kinds of racial profiling, and extreme violence against minorities, where the violence is often less against individuals that aren't of those minorities. All right. So now that we've talked about, a few distinctions that have to do with racism and different kinds of racism, pointing out like the different sorts, let's get into the sort of, I think, what is maybe for some people the meat and potatoes of what's actually at issue here. Do intentions matter when it comes to racist and sexist actions? Of course, there is a difference between intentions and effects. But this is often an issue with respect to different kinds of racism and sexism. Actions that we take may be construed as racist or sexist, even though we don't have the intentions of coming off as racist or sexist. So do the intentions actually matter? Sure, sometimes they do. Sometimes you do something and the effect of it is detrimental, but you're less culpable for not doing it intentionally. However, even if you didn't do it intentionally, that doesn't necessarily mitigate the harm that it causes. Often nowadays, we call out people for unintentional actions in order to root out institutionalized ways of thinking that are racist or sexist. It's often we see people often unintentionally acting racist or sexist. Then we see people that are acting intentionally. We ought, though, give, generally with people a principle of charity. It's often best to call people out when they do unintentionally say something or act in a certain racist or sexist way. But at the same time, it's best to give them the benefit of the doubt with respect to their intentions. More often than not, people are not trying to harm anyone. But oftentimes, nowadays especially, people need to be taught anti-racism and anti-sexism, and they need to unlearn the ingrained behaviors that they've been, brought up with, especially the people that we tend to call our parents and grandparents. Now, some people are certainly overly sensitive, I guess, or really that's not the right word. There are people that are willing and able, or sort of actively attempting to miscontextualize things that are said in order to take some sort of offense or score some sort of social and political points in a power struggle. Where there are sometimes people that are actually sensitive to the racial issues that are actually there, right? People that are overly sensitive should be able to pick up on when intentions don't match actions. So don't confuse those people that are sensitive to racial and sexist-based issues with those people that are malicious in the sense that they're trying to, find people to call out with respect to those things. More often than not, people really aren't intentionally trying to be demeaning, but that's not to defend the fact that their actions aren't harmful. Being historically sensitive to things really does matter. Kitchens, like, the kitchen in your house is not a particularly normally thought of as a place where, there's some morally charged issue, but because of the history of the phrase "a woman's place is in the kitchen," sometimes mentalities or jokes of a certain sort are sexist, right? Similarly with racist jokes and racially insensitive jokes, these kinds of things need to be rooted out, but rooted out in a tactful and nuanced way to help the people, especially those that are unintentionally still committing these sexist and racist actions. Now, finally, what about harm? What exactly does racist and sexist actions, what does it do to people? Well, so we get, at least from Bloom's definition, we get two forms of harm, two things that are of interest here in his definition of racism. So inferiorization is to treat something as inferior in any way. Now, of course, some things are inferior, right? So I can make two sandwiches and one could be inferior to the other. Often inferiorization is going to be based on some sort of extrinsic issue, that is an external feature of the thing. In such cases, we can undertake or must undertake empirical methods to determine whether the inferiority really holds, right? So I can clearly determine whether or not which of my two sandwiches is better by eating one of them, right? Or by trying them both, really, and seeing which one tastes better than the other. For some kinds of things, checking for inferiorization can be difficult, but for others, it's pretty easy. We're at a place now with respect to society, with respect to both sex and race, to determine that inferiorization between sexes and races does not exist, even though some people still argue along these lines. There's still positions that people take that women are somehow unable to work the front lines of the military, even though it's been shown that again and again that they have just as much ability as men. And there's even a book recently, as recent as 1994, that argues that human intelligence is a combination of inherited and environmental factors, and that race really does play a role in general intelligence. This book is, in a sense, engendering, it's laid a certain basis of thought for some, and some people appeal to it to make claims that certain people based on their race are less or more intelligent. These are all extrinsic factors that we've talked about here. There might also be, though, some intrinsic ones. So some things that are in one sense worse, or some might think that that women are inferior because that's the way that God made them, or that some races are worse because they're not even human. This is a sort of intrinsic racism, and it's often harder to argue against, because it usually accompanies some form of non-rational faith or non-rational assumption. Often these kinds of views don't accompany antipathy, as in the case of slave owners, or maybe, like, to make an analogy, compare modern day pet owners. You don't think your dog is on your level. You don't think of your dog as at the same level as another human. But you don't hate your dog. You simply think of them as inferior to you because they're a dog, not a human being. And, you know, if you're not thinking about your dog, maybe you do, maybe you love your dog. I mean, I love my dog. Maybe you do think of your dog as sort of on your level. Take something else, like your pet fish. Is your pet fish at the same level as you? No. So to think that is to in some sense inferiorize that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have hate for your fish. The other main component of Bloom's definition of racism, and I think this applies also to sexism, is antipathy. Antipathy is a general aversion or deep-seated dislike for something, a form of hatred sometimes. This is an emotional state generally, and one can feel this if one believes that other races or sexes are of the same status. That is, you can feel antipathy without taking seriously inferiorization. You could think that you could be a white person and think that black people are not somehow inferior to whites and still hate them in some sense, feel antipathy. Sometimes antipathy goes with a general form of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism, is the view that that your society, your cultural group is somehow better than someone else's. So that would involve inferiorization, but it doesn't involve racial inferiorization. Sometimes this antipathy will go along with certain kinds of mentalities, like they took our jobs, or more often than not, a general sort of hatred that gets stoked in some way. There have been studies that show that antipathy of this sort tends not to exist in children of a certain age. And so it seems that this form of racism is genuinely learned. Antipathy is often less prevalent in certain kinds of sexist relations, though some men do only see women as to be dominated. And this may be something like antipathy. Sometimes men see women as only good for sexual domination, and this may, in one sense or another, also be rooted in a deep-seated form of antipathy. There are clearly certain forms of sexism that are antipathy-based, especially like, a lot of the cases of where like serial killers, where they've murdered numbers of women, it seems to be based in a deep-seated hatred towards women. However, more often than not, today men in Western secular society are not hateful of women, but tend to inferiorize them sort of implicitly. However, there are, other issues, things like incels, where they tend, it's not clear if they inferiorize women, but they do seem to think that women somehow owe them something. And it's very unclear how we ought to think about those. That's another really interesting issue that I wish we had time to think and talk more about that here. All right, what about stereotypes? So stereotypes are often, cited as racist or sexist, but I don't think all stereotypes are racist or sexist. Not all stereotypes are as harmful as others. Some aren't even harmful, though we shouldn't make generalizations, and we definitely shouldn't conclude things on the basis of problematic stereotypes. Some are problematic. Some inferiorize, and some lead to antipathy. Some, though, are based in things like racial anxiety. And sometimes we need to sort of attempt to fix these things and avoid using cultural stereotypes and sexist stereotypes. But they're not always bad. In some cases, stereotyping actually is meant to be condoning or approving of particular groups. And this is like my example earlier, saying things like women tend to be caregivers. That seems to be a stereotype, but it doesn't seem to be sexist in the sense that it's not derogatory. Similarly, I think other kinds of issues, so like racial, certain kinds of racial stereotypes, or that may be based in ethnic stereotyping, things like food stereotypes, that Asian people like rice, or that African American people like fried chicken. These kinds of stereotypes are, in a certain sense, neutral until they get added to something that has an aspect of inferiorization or antipathy kind of baked into it, right? You have to think in some way that eating lots of fried chicken leads to bad things, or is somehow unhealthy, or is somehow means that someone is not of a very high class or something, in order for the stereotype to actually take on the bad connotation that it in some way, shape, or form has. Now, that doesn't mean that these stereotypes, that you can go around sort of making these stereotypes willy-nilly, though, while trying to keep them apart from feelings of inferiorization or antipathy, because sometimes these stereotypes are deep-seated in historical issues. And if they're deep-seated in historical issues and you don't know about those historical issues, then you may be sort of falling into a racist or sexist stereotype, because you don't know about the history of the issue. How might we try to solve the problems of racism and sexism? Well, there are lots of different things that we can kind of try to do, and lots of different kinds of things that we can think about. One thing is that we can be overly vigilant of our own actions and those of our friends and family. We can try to be allies for people of other races and of other sexes. We can try as hard as we can to not back down in the face of hate and stand up for what is right. When you see certain acts of racism and sexism, you can call it out and stick to your guns. The person performing the action can try to defend themselves, but you don't have to back down and capitulate. Racism and sexism are wrong, period. And you are fully within your rights to stand your ground. Institutional racism is probably the most pernicious and problematic form of racism, that partly because it's so hard to actually root out and get rid of. It's like baked into the norms of our society, the rules that we follow, the ways that we live our lives. And so, that's really hard, but we can try to find it and point it out. And we do so every once in a while. These things are progressing. And so, we can continue to progress. One obvious way that we might be able to help root out institutional racism and sexism is to vote for those people that we see as actually doing something about institutional racism and sexism. I would suggest mostly along those lines. I've seen people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actively pursuing issues like that. Elizabeth Warren actively pursuing issues like that. Sometimes Bernie Sanders as well. Moving forward, all right, so beyond this issue, so why start with this issue? Well, in order to sort of get you excited, I want you to realize that, philosophy can deal with current events and real issues before we start getting into the weeds of philosophy, where things just aren't so like grab you by the horns, exciting recent events that where you don't know how to feel or what to think exactly about what's going on. or that you can go out on the streets and march and yell and scream about, and write, nasty letters to your congressperson telling them about how bad of a job that they're doing because they didn't vote for the last, thing that you wanted them to vote for. Moving forward, though, we've got to start breaking down some of the issues that we've just confronted in thinking about these issues, the issues of racism and sexism. And so here are a bunch of questions that I want you to sort of start to think about. Then some of these we'll actually maybe try to get to in the weeks ahead. So ethics questions that have come up in this discussion today. What is it to actually harm someone? What is it to cause harm to a person? And what is it that makes harming someone wrong? So clearly harming someone is to treat them wrongly, but what is it that makes doing harm to someone wrong? Why is it wrong to harm someone? How can the things that we say harm others? That is, like, if someone uses a racial slur towards someone else, how does that actually harm the other person? Or maybe if you just say something derogatory, or you cuss out your mom because she doesn't let you have your way. How can the way that we treat someone harm them? How is it that our actions, through just merely are including or excluding people from certain scenarios, harm them? Here are some metaphysical questions that are worth contemplating. What is race? What is the difference between being black and being white, or being Asian, or being American Indian, Native American, being Latino? These are really difficult questions to answer. It's very unclear what a race is. Take, for example, here's something that I've always found wild to think about. President previous president Barack Obama is half black. He has a white parent and a black parent. In South Africa, people that are half black count as being white. Whereas in the United States, people that are half black count as being black. So the racial distinction between being white and black between the United States and South Africa is very confusing. Similarly, another question that's really interesting: what's the difference between biological sex and gender? Gender is a very fluid and interesting concept that is currently being worked out before our very eyes. Biological sex seems to be something like a natural kind, and there seems to be a very big difference between biological sex and gender, but some people are very, very adamant about there not being a difference there. So it's interesting to think about the metaphysics of those issues. Epistemology, some other questions that we might ask. How do we determine which attitudes and actions of ours are racist or sexist when no one calls us out on them? I know that this is sort of an issue that I feel like I've experienced in my life before, being in certain situations where I'm insulated with respect to racist ways of thinking or ways of acting, because I don't have access or I'm not around people of certain races. So it's difficult to know when a certain action would be racist, or a certain way of thinking would be racist. Similarly, another issue in epistemology: how do I know if I'm doing the right thing in calling out my racist uncle, right? In cases in which you're talking to family members about race, say you're at the Thanksgiving dinner table and your racist uncle makes a racist comment, and you well, is it worth it to call them out? How do you know? Is it actually going to help? Is it going to help them? Is it going to help people around them that listen? How do we know these things? And if we don't know, is it worth it? Right. All right. Next time, I just want to sort of lay out a trigger warning for our next lecture. Topics in this class here at the beginning of the class are somewhat intense and can be very personal. I don't want anyone to be caused any sort of anxiety or distress, but these topics are certainly issues that matter. So try your best if you can to, and if you do experience anxiety, to think about these issues by putting on your objective hat and looking at just the facts and trying to ignore the emotionally heavy or charged parts of the subject matter. That being said, the next subject that we're going to be discussing is the ethics of abortion. The question, like the sort of main question for that section is it ever permissible to have an abortion? And I want you to read the Judith Jarvis Thompson article, A Defense of Abortion.